will last about 35 minutes, I expect, and then we'll have time for question and answer. Certainly you can type questions into the chat. I won't monitor the chat because I have a terrible time doing that while I'm also presenting, but I have several colleagues here today who will be monitoring that and can always answer questions, or we can take them at the end. So with that, I am Mackenzie Sullivan. I'm the Director of Graduate Student Career Services in our College of Liberal Arts. I'm going to be talking today about interviewing and negotiations. This is the 5th session of our 5-part workshop series, Jobs Beyond Academia, serving the entire University of Minnesota PhD and master's degree students and postdocs. This is a series we've now done 2 years in a row and hope to do it next year. Close to the end of the session, Drew will be dropping in a link for an evaluation. We always try to make this better for next year, and so we appreciate your feedback. Drew will drop that in closer to the end. I am going to let my colleagues who are here just do a brief introduction of themselves as well. You've seen many of them before. And certainly, folks, if I've forgotten to mention any of the logistics, go ahead and do that. So, Carolyn, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes, absolutely. Hi, my name is Carolyn. I use she, her pronouns, and I am a career counselor with the College of Education and Human Development. Do you want to go next, Maria?
Hi, my name is Maria Hoffman. I work with Mackenzie at College of Liberal Arts in the Office for Research and Graduate Programs.
Hi, everybody. My name is Drew Swenhaugen. Thanks for being here. I work within the graduate school, and I work closely with the career services folks here.
Okay, fabulous. So why don't we go ahead and get started? As a presenter, I love it when folks are willing to turn their cameras on because it gives me an idea when I can see faces of if my points are hitting home or not. I also know that some folks are not able to turn on cameras or uncomfortable. If you happen to be eating lunch, I'm fine with that too. So anyone who is willing and would like to turn on their cameras, I always appreciate that. Okay, and with that, let's get started. So today we're going to talk about interviewing and negotiations. This is the last, as I said, in our 5-part job search series. We covered in the last 4 sessions, we did a little self-assessment in the beginning. For those of you who remember that, Carolyn did a little bit of that. We did some sessions on loss of identity and resilience. Maria did that. We did exploring and researching. We did your materials last week, cover letters and CVs and resumes. And now we're going to talk about interviewing and negotiations today. So we're sort of combining 2 sessions because they're so closely related. As you probably know, if you've been here before, this series is really preparation for your job search. It's sort of an introductory 101 session. This won't get you the job, but hopefully leads you through all of the steps that you would need to conduct your job search. We focus beyond academia. These sessions support each other and inform each other, but they do stand alone. So those of you who are only here today and haven't attended previous sessions, that's fine. We always want to remind you that we have a Canvas course that's really useful because we have the materials in there that we talk about in our sessions, and they can help you as you're preparing for your job search. So the session that we're doing today around interviewing and negotiations, people will always say, like, where do I find salary information? What are these S.T.A.R frameworks we talk about? They're all in the Canvas site, and so we'll refer to them today, but know that you can access those within the Canvas site. Okay, so let's get to interviewing. So we talked about last week, right? The resume, it'll get you the interview, but that's what it gets you. It only gets you as far as the interview. The interview, of course, is the thing that gets you the job. So today we're going to talk a little bit about the kinds of interviews you might encounter, formats, types of questions. We'll get into how you prepare. We don't have time to do a practice today. And of course, I'm going to recommend you practice, but we'll at least get you through the frameworks of basic behavioral interviewing and talk about some other types of interviews that you might encounter. And then we'll end with a little bit about how you negotiate job offers. So when you get called up by a recruiter or you get emailed, somebody will say, hello, we'd love to interview you. And you say, great, I'd love to hear more. What's the format going to look like? It's always helpful to know ahead of time because interviews come in various formats. Often a first round interview, which we will talk more in depth about in a little bit, will be a one-on-one interview. You'll be talking with a single person, phone, Zoom, probably. You often in a second round or more rounds will encounter what we would call a panel. That might just be 2 people. It could be 4 people, and you are having discussion with that panel of people. Sometimes you're asked to do a presentation, which is in some ways similar to a job talk. You might ask to present some material. You almost always will have some behavioral component. We'll spend some time on that today because that is, I would say, that crosses industries, sectors, and jobs. Some of the other formats are maybe more for one specific sector, so we don't get into that today, but almost everybody will have some component of a behavioral interview. Some of you will have technical interviews if you are going into some science-related fields. User experience research has a technical side, and again, that's going to be very specific to your field. But know that that often is a component of some interviews. Sometimes folks have a case interview where they'll say, here's some material. We want you to study that, and you're going to walk us through what that looks like and help us come up with a solution to that. It's also called like a situational walkthrough. Often interviews will be live, right? Live, I mean, on the phone, video, or in person, but increasingly we're seeing a recorded video, especially for a first round, where they send you a link. The computer asks you questions, you record yourself answering them, and then you submit it. I think those are very tough interviews. I always recommend practicing those, but those are increasingly common for first round interviews. As you're looking at these, possibly besides like the technical interview, you may notice that many of these formats do mirror academic interviews, right? A presentation is much like a job talk. These one-on-one is much like an interview you might have in the beginning, right? And then you might have to sit down with the entire department. That's kind of like the panel. So they're different, but the formats are similar in a lot of ways. So let's look at what a first round would look like, and then we'll look at how does that compare to a second round, or sometimes you get a third round or a fourth round. So your first round is really what we would consider a screening interview. And I want to make the caveat that this is a generality, right? Every once in a while, a first round will look different, or maybe in your particular field, it looks different. So because we're speaking to a broad audience, we can't speak in specifics, but 90% of the time, a first round is a screening interview. They're looking for basic qualifications. They're looking for your interests in the organization. It's usually somewhere in the nature of 30 minutes. It could be as short as 15 minutes. It's one-on-one mostly. It's often with a human resources representative, especially if it's a larger organization. If it's a smaller organization, it could be the hiring manager, but it's often with a human resources person, and they're asking you some basic questions. Zoom, phone, as we talked about, sometimes they're recorded and you submit it. There'll be general questions, tell me more about your background, walk me through your resume, why do you want this job, what's your interest in us? So general questions, less usually about getting into your exact skill sets or experiences, but more trying to understand, do you have the basic qualifications and what's your interest in us? And then from that interviewer would make the decision, do we move you forward to the next round of interviews? And hopefully the answer is yes. And if they do, then you're going to start encountering formats a little bit more like what we talked about. They're more likely to be in person, although, now that we've sort of gone to a Zoom society, I'm seeing sometimes where all rounds of interviews are over Zoom, but they're more likely to be in person. They're more likely to be at the employer's location. They often will be behavioral, sort of these general interviews combined with a presentation or a case or a scenario or lunch with the team, or formats that are more than just chatting one-on-one with a person. They can be a half day, they can be a full day. I've seen up to as much as like 2-day interviews. Sometimes you're doing multiple interviews with multiple parties. Increasingly, as we're in a Zoom society, I'm seeing a switch to, rather than going to the employer's location and having like a full round of interviews, you might just have 4 or 5 or 6 rounds with various parties. So it would be like as if you were at their location, but instead you're doing, Thursday at 2, you're going to meet with a group of people, and then Friday at 4, you're going to meet with another group of people. And then if you pass that, you're going to meet with them. So it's just stretching it out over multiple days, but the same idea of meeting with multiple parties. And so in these rounds, they're really digging deeper into what are the skills you have. Are you, do you have the experience? Do you know how to, talk about our organization in language that makes sense to us? Are you a good fit, which is a little bit of a loaded term? As we look at, what people are like and what we consider fit, right? It's a concept that's fraught, I will say that. But it is what people are looking at. What we're looking at basically is like, does this person seem to understand our organization? Can we see working with this person, right? If we have a 10-hour project, will we enjoy sitting in the room with the person, right? Again, it's a fraught concept, but it is how human beings work. So you want to think about like, what is kind of the cultural of this organization, and how do I judge that? And do I want to be a fit? And if I do want to be a fit with that, how am I presenting in myself in a way that they understand that I understand their organization? Okay, so how do you go about preparing for all of this? The first thing that you want to do is spend some time doing research into the employer you're looking at, the type of position you're looking at, and who might be interviewing you. If you know that, you don't always know that, but sometimes you do. In my experience, this is the part that's most neglected by students. They'll think a lot about their resume and what they want to talk about, but they don't spend enough time researching the company. And then when they get into the interview, they're asked questions they don't understand, or they don't know why they're being asked that, or they can't give a good answer because they don't know enough about the employer. So start out just by looking at the company website. You can look at the link that we've talked about multiple times, the Researching Employers, Industries, and Career Opportunities, that is put out by our library system. That link is in Canvas. Certainly, if you know anybody who works at that organization, you'd want to chat with them. LinkedIn is a good place to research individuals. Twitter is another place. I know some academics like to stay off of Twitter because again, it's not always a friendly place, but if you do use it and you want to research people, you can often see what are people talking about, what's the organization posting about. Looking at news sources, what's being put out in the news about this organization. And you want to be looking at what's the language they use, what kind of projects are they working on, what seem to be their priorities, what are the commonalities you have, maybe particularly with people who might be interviewing you. And all of this sort of forms your background for figuring out how you want to present yourself in your interview. So, right, you're looking at the organization, you're researching it, and you're figuring out how you fit in. So the second part of that, of course, is the figuring out how you fit in and how you want to present yourself. So you're thinking as you're going through this, what do you have to offer them? What is it that you can bring skill set wise, knowledge wise, personality wise, trait wise? What do you have to offer to this organization? You've already written about this in your resume and your cover letter. So you're not starting from scratch, right? You're saying, here's the things I said in my resume and cover letter I could offer. Do I need to expand on that? Is there something I didn't know about before I applied, but maybe I found out in my research? You want to think about, particularly because you'll be asked this question, what is it about that employer and that position that is so interesting to you? And I think that's pretty important. I mean, it's pretty important for any interview, but it's very important for PhDs who are being trained in academia, who might be looking at something different, because you want the employer to understand, why is it that you want to work for them? Why does this make sense? Do they understand that, you have a real interest in what they're doing? And thinking a little bit through that question of why you are deciding to move into a different sector, not focusing on, which I know is true for some folks in academia, I want to get the heck out of there, right? Like that's been bad for me. I want to do something different. But no employer wants to hear that, right? They don't want to hear about the bad part of the other thing, because what they want to know is, why do you want to work for them? Not why you didn't want to work someplace else. So, and this can really, company research can really help with that, to say like, oh my gosh, I didn't even know they did that. That is really exciting. I could be excited about that. I could talk about that in my interview. So knowing why and explaining to an employer why is pretty important. Okay, so as you are starting, you've done some research, you've thought about a lot of these things, hopefully you've taken some notes. You want to really start doing some preparation. There's a really, really good preparation worksheet that I like in the Canvas course. And some of the things it will ask you is, list the 5 most important things you want the employer to know about you. And I think this is important, because sometimes we just start getting into like, I'm going to prepare for my strengths and weaknesses, but we haven't thought about what is it that we want to communicate. So you'll be asked a lot of questions, but many questions can be answered in a lot of different ways. And you want to think about, what is it that I want them to know about me before I leave the interview? And how am I going to make sure that I get those points across? So I think that's really important to think about on the front thing. It doesn't have to be 5, right? There's no magic number in 5. It could be 4, but what is it that you want the employer to know about you? And then you can do things like, what you would do for your resume, circling skills and experiences that you will want to be able to prove to the employer. And you're going to be preparing what we call a S.T.A.R story. We're going to talk about that. For the skills that they're looking at. There's other things in this behavioral interview prep worksheet that I think are really useful, but these are 2 that I just wanted to talk about today. So what, I've been saying behavioral interview, S.T.A.R, right? Let's dig through this and like typical types of questions. S.T.A.R is a format around skills and traits, so we'll get to that closer to the end. But typical types of questions that you'll get in what we call a behavioral interview, which I am differentiating right from a technical or a situational or a case interview. These are really, the questions that they're going to ask you about yourself. And so you're going to get questions like, tell me about yourself, walk me through the resume, talk to me about your background. Why are you interested in this position? Why this employer? What are your strengths and weaknesses? What do you bring? Talk about your skills and traits. Do you have questions for me? So those are some of the typical ones. Now let's walk through each of those and see what they look like and how you might prepare for those. Okay, so tell me more about yourself. That's basically your story. And so in each of the slides we're looking at, I've put this why section. So why are they asking me this, right? Do they want me just to regurgitate my resume, and to some extent a little bit, right? But what they're trying to understand is, in 2 minutes, no more than 2 minutes, maybe slightly less, right? Not 5 minutes. Who are you? What experience and skills and motivations do you bring to us? In 2 minutes, it would be considered kind of like your elevator pitch, if people have heard that term before. So a very short, these are the things I want you to know about me. And again, when you're doing your preparation, you're thinking, what are the 5 things I want them to know about me? This is a good place to include those things. It's usually done reverse chronologically. So, I decided to do my bachelor's degree at Oberlin College because why? And then I decided to do my PhD because why, right? You want to talk to them about the transitions in reverse chronological order. People will ask me what goes in that story, and the way I really think about it is, what in your background is relevant to that employer? So that is often your academics, your professional, your volunteer experience. Sometimes it can be things about your personal experience, personal life, who you were growing up, who you are now, particularly for nonprofits, NGOs who deal with certain populations if you share the same identity. So I would never say never include personal information, but this is mainly your professional related skills. And again, you want to focus on the why. Employers like to understand why you make the decisions you do. It helps them understand your motivations, but particularly when you are transitioning to something that your degree wouldn't necessarily be training you for, that's important for them to understand. I do know that, again, sometimes people are like, the reason I'm transitioning is because I want to get the heck out of academia. And that is, again, not a story that you want to tell, right? You might say, you know, academia has not been the best fit for me. And so what I really, you know, I did some research. What I really am interested in doing is taking the research that I do and be able to use it in an applied setting, right? And I can use that applied setting here at Google doing UX research. So I think that's a good way to frame it. But remember, you want to frame it on the positive. Why are you looking at that position? Why are you looking at that employer? Okay, the dreaded strengths and weaknesses question. Sometimes that also sometimes it gets framed as like, what are some of the things you're working on? Or strengths could be, what could you bring to our organization? So remember, the questions won't always be exactly this wording, but it's getting at the same concept. So why are they asking you about your strengths? Again, they want to understand, how can you contribute to my organization? What can you bring? You know, you want to think about 2 or 3 things that you bring to the organization that you feel like are your strongest points. You want to provide examples of where you're using those strengths. And of course, you want them to be relevant to the position. So if the position, again, is UX research, you want to talk about where you have done research that helps somebody understand the way users use a platform or a product. Weaknesses. Why are they asking you that? It's not because they want to humiliate anybody, but it's really because they want to understand, are you self-aware enough to know the things that you're not so great at, that you need to work on? Nobody expects you to be perfect in everything. And if you think you're perfect at everything, they probably don't want to hire you because you're not a person who's willing to learn. So it's really around sort of self-awareness. Are you aware what you're not good at? Good examples are things that I would say are genuine. You want them to be something that's genuinely true. I used to hear a lot of, you know, what's a weakness? And somebody'd say, well, I'm a perfectionist. And then they try to swing that into a weakness. Right? Usually people are just saying, like, that's actually a strength, but I'm going to pretend it's a weakness. Now it could be, if you're saying, I'm a perfectionist in that I don't always know when to stop on a project, when it's good enough, right? Then that's maybe a true weakness, right? Like I just can't ever figure out what's good enough. And so if that truly is something, then you could say, and here is how I deal with that situation, right? Like, I never know when to stop working on a project, and then I'm late on deadlines because I just keep working on it because I think it's not good enough. So how I've come to combat that is I've given myself a deadline, or I repeatedly remind myself that deadline is more important than perfection. You know, as I've been working on this, I now meet my deadlines 98% of the time, or something. So something you're working on, something that's genuine, something that you can show you're making progress on and give concrete examples, and certainly not something that is a deal breaker. So if you are applying for a quantitative researcher position and you say, my data skills in Excel are really terrible, right? Then people are gonna be like, no, right? That's a deal breaker for this position. So you don't want to focus on things that are deal breakers, but you do want to focus on something that's genuine, because otherwise it comes off as made up and nobody wants to hear that. Okay, so now on to the behavioral questions, where they are asking about your skills. You will see this acronym S.T.A.R. Sometimes it's C.A.R. Sometimes it's, I've even seen other acronyms that are somewhat similar to those. But basically what S.T.A.R. or C.A.R. are formats for answering the questions of trying to get at your skill sets. And so if they're trying to get at, like, how does Mackenzie take initiative on something? Like, we want to understand her initiative. So what they might say is, tell me about a time you took initiative on a project. Why are they asking this? because there is a theory that your past behavior is the best predictor of your future behavior. Now, I will say, as you look at trends moving on out of behavioral interviewing, we're now moving into something, I think, down the road, more like situational interviewing. So this format could be going away, but it's not right now. So it's important to think about it and to learn about it right now. The reason that we have this format for answering this question is because people get into trying to talk about initiative and they end up just, the story wanders all over the place. And I always call it like you're lost in a swamp. You started telling me something and you're over there and you're over there. And then 5 minutes later, the story ends and I can't exactly get what you're saying, because these questions are hard, sometimes hard to think about and hard to explain. And so we have a format, S.T.A.R, which is situation. What's a situation? What's the exact task you have to complete? What is the action that you took to complete that? And what's the result? C.A.R, again, is another format. I think it's context. What's the context? What's the action you took? What's the result, right? Same concept, but it's giving you a formula to answer these questions so that you're not wandering all over everywhere. And at the end of 2 minutes, you have given me, this is my full complete story in 2 minutes, and Mackenzie can understand what you're talking about. So you want to tell a very specific situation. You don't want to say, well, I take initiative a lot of the time. I've started a few programs and then I usually complete them and they're pretty good, right? Like that doesn't tell me anything. So you want to give a very specific example. I noticed that my students were having a hard time knowing how to pursue and get internships. There's a situation. So the task was, I decided that what we really needed to do was start an internship program for our students. Right? What's the actions I took? I wanted to look for funding, right? And I created programming and we did this. And then the result is many of my students ended up getting internships, right? So that's a very specific example. It might not be the only example of a time I've taken initiative, but it is a concrete example. And that's what I want you to think about. Generalities do not work in these stories. So it's specific examples of where you've exhibited the skills. And so they're often looking for initiative, conflict with coworkers, ability to organize yourself, sometimes dependability, ability to work with teams. And so they will be asking you questions around that. Again, if you're looking for like, what are the questions? Like, what are some examples? In the Canvas course, we've got a couple lists of like typical behavioral interview questions. So that's this whole S.T.A.R, C.A.R, behavioral, looking at a format for helping you answer a question in a way that makes sense to the employer. You'll notice I've talked a lot about like 2 minutes. I'm a firm believer in, particularly if it is a video or phone, but even in person, for most interview questions, you don't want to spend more than 2 minutes because a human brain doesn't focus for much longer than that. So if you're into answering a question in 5 minutes, you've probably lost the person. So I use 2 minutes as sort of this rule of thumb. Okay. I'm not sure if I had this in my previous list of questions, but often at the end of an interview, they'll say, what questions do you have for us? And so again, why are we asking this? One, they generally want to know, like, do you have the information that you need? If we move to the next round, do you have the information you need going into that interview? But they're also trying to figure out, like, do you care enough about us to spend some time doing some research? Do you actually understand what you're applying for? Or are you random, are you taking like, I'm going to apply for 50 jobs, I'm going to shoot out a bunch of resumes and I'm going to go into some interviews. So if you haven't spent the time to understand the employer, they're probably thinking, yeah, you don't want that job that much. So that's why they're asking it. The reason I think it's important for students to think about it is because you really do want to know going into an interview, what do you need to make a judgment about moving to the next round? There are times that they might say, yeah, we think you're a good fit, we want to move you to the next round of interviews. And you might not want to. You might say, no, after that first round, it's not going to be a fit for me. It's not a place I want to work. And so think through what is it that you're honestly curious about that will help you make that determination. Or are there things you don't understand about the organization, you don't understand about the job, that even after doing some research, you just can't figure out? And so the best questions, honestly, are the things that you are curious about. Short of that, sometimes people are like, I'm struggling to think of some good questions. You can always ask questions that will help you get a sense of like, what would you be doing every day? How does that fit in with what other people are doing? You know, will you be working with a team on a daily basis? Will you mostly be on your own? People often want to try to understand the environment or the culture, which is of course really important, because we know that's really what determines if somebody's happy at a job or not. But to say to somebody, what's the culture of your organization, is an impossible question for somebody to answer. It doesn't mean anything. Like, what do you mean the culture? Like, do you mean, are we friendly, or like, what do you mean by culture? And so you want to, I've put a list of questions that can help get at culture. Knowing that, again, also we have some examples in the Canvas site of things that can help you think about these questions, but questions that help get at culture are like, what do you like about working here? Right? If you ask Mackenzie, what does she like about working here? She will talk a lot about colleagues, right? Like, these are some of the things, right? What else do I like? I like my students. I like the flexibility I have in my work. It gives you a really good sense of like, how does this culture function? Another way I've seen people get at it is, what types of people are successful here? Because then it can help you understand, is that the kind of person that I am? If they're saying, oh, you really got to be super extroverted to work here because, everyone talks all the time and you won't get a word in edgewise. And you're like, I'm an introvert. This isn't going to work well for me. Or questions like, what surprises people about working here? Those are questions that will help you get at culture without having to say, what's the culture? Because again, that's a really hard question for people to answer. Salary requirements, not always. But sometimes you'll get the salary requirements question in a first round interview. Sometimes you'll get it in the application, which we talked about 3 weeks ago, like, what do you put there? But you sometimes will get, not usually at the beginning, sometimes, but often at the end, what are your salary requirements? What kind of salary do you hope to get? Why are they asking you this? They are really trying to judge if the salary that they have to offer, and it's probably a range of salary, right? But is it in the ballpark? So if they say your salary requirements, you say, $200,000 and they only have $100,000 to offer, then they're going to be like, no matter how good you are, there's just no way we're going to be able to meet that. And so they're really trying to make this judgment of like, are you in the ballpark of what they're looking at? This is where it's, of course, super important to do this research. Again, what is a ballpark salary for the type of position you're looking at? The Canvas site, things like salary.com, payscale.com, some of those sources will give you some information about typical salaries. Sometimes it's really hard to find. A lot of times you're relying on other people reporting salaries, and if only a small number of people report, you don't know how accurate it is. So the sites are not perfect, but they often can give you at least a range of salaries. And so when you get asked this question, some people recommend trying to deflect it, like, well, really, it's just the job that's important to me. The salary isn't as important. But I don't believe that usually works, because usually they really, really do need to know, like, are we in the same ballpark? Sometimes you can ask, like, what are you willing to offer for this? And they will be willing to disclose a range. But if they're not, you can say, with my skills, I would hope to receive between X and X, or I hope to make somewhere in the range of X to Y, but I really am interested in the position, and so I can be flexible. But you do usually want to give them a range that includes, sort of that midpoint, median average of what you can tell is offered in general for a type of position, because that will make sure that you're not ruled out of the position. What I will say, though, is to know your bottom line is also pretty important. So if you're like, I cannot live on anything with my family less than $80,000 a year, then you will want to say like, my range is between 80 and 100. Because you can't live on anything less than that. So it might rule you out of the job, but that's probably okay if you know that you can't live on that salary. So when all of the questions are done, closing the interview. So, they'll often say, do you have any questions for us, right? You get to ask the questions and then they will say, thank you so much. You at that point do get the chance often to say, thank you so much. There's one thing I didn't get to talk about that I did want to mention. I actually got a certification a month ago, in instructional design, and I forgot to mention that, right? Sometimes there's just like things at the end that you're like, I forgot to say, but that's really important. You can insert that in there. If they haven't said, we'll get back to you next week, you need to ask them, when do you think you might get back to me about next rounds of interviews? What's your process for your own mental health? That's pretty important to know, knowing that they often will miss that deadline, but you'll at least get a ballpark for like when they might get back to you. You want to thank them, thank you so much. I'm really interested in this position. I hope I get to advance to the next round. It's been a pleasure meeting you. Ask for their contact information if you don't have it. Why? Because you need to send them a follow-up email saying thank you. That's kind of I would say standard in almost any industry. People expect that they get a thank you email of some sort, hopefully within 24 hours. Does not have to be a handwritten note anymore. Personalized if you can. Thank you, Mackenzie. It was really good to interview you. It was super fun to talk about your 27 cats. Since I also have 27 cats, I look forward to hearing from you. So something personal about the person that you learned or about their job. Mackenzie, was very interesting to hear how you started that internship program. It's something I had thought about in my previous job, something that shows you paid a little bit of attention to some of the things that I talked about. If you haven't heard back by the expected date, and that happens a lot, you think that, companies have it together and they'll get back to you by the expected date. They mostly don't. Everyone, thinks that they're going to have a better timeline than they do. But if you haven't heard back by the expected date, it's really, really okay to email your contact and say, hey, still really interested in your position. Could you let me know where you are in the hiring process? That's a very acceptable email to send. And hopefully you get a response to that. You might not, but hopefully you do. Okay, so after that, hopefully you progress to the second or more rounds, but those are way, way more specific to certain fields. And so you'll want to work with alumni or with your career center on those future rounds of interviews. Trying to figure out if we should, let's quickly talk about negotiations. I'm going to whip through this and then we'll take time for questions because I think there are some in the chat. So negotiations, you've got the job offer. Yay, very exciting, right? If somebody calls you with a job offer, do not accept. Do not say, yes, I want that job. Only because it's really good to take a tiny bit of time to think about it, even if it's an hour or a day. You want to make sure that you know what you're getting yourself into. If somebody calls you, you don't have the terms of that employment, right? Always on the phone. So I think it's a great practice to say, thank you so much. I'm really excited. Do you think you would be able to get me the written offer in the next day or two? I'd love to have a little bit of time to think about it. And sometimes they'll say, yes, we'll get you that tomorrow. We need to know within a week. Hopefully you can let them know. If you can't let them know, it is okay to ask for more time. That's usually good to talk to a career person about how you negotiate that. But if you verbally accept on the phone, that is considered an acceptance. And so if I were a person, I would want to know all of the terms before I officially accepted something. And so, should you negotiate once you have those terms? Almost always yes. It's good practice. Everyone needs to learn to do it. It's super uncomfortable. It's uncomfortable for almost everybody. And it's really good practice to learn how to do. A lot of employers actually expect it too. But this is, of course, not until you get the offer. As you're thinking about negotiating, we're going to talk about this a tiny bit. Salary is very important. It just is. We need money to live on. It's not the only negotiable point. And I think we've really realized this during the pandemic. There are other things that are very important to people, where you live, can you work remotely, some other things. And we're going to look at that quickly. The only times I would say don't negotiate is if they have very clearly said, just like, this is non-negotiable. This is the only thing. We're not making any changes. Bush Foundation does that in town. I actually think it's a great process. They say, here's the salary and terms, and we put that right out there from the beginning. So I wish people would go to that. We're not there now. But if you have no basis to negotiate, it's a great salary. It's a great vacation. You get to work remotely. Like, what are you going to negotiate? So, or if you have no intention of taking the job, don't put them through that if you have no intention. So what is negotiable? This worksheet is in the Canvas course. I think it's great. It's out of UCLA, but it lists off some of these things. You know, base salary, we talked about that. That's often something people want to negotiate, but you can negotiate your working title, which can be important for future promotion. You can sometimes negotiate your job duties. You can negotiate flex time. You can sometimes negotiate bonuses or relocation. And so think about, you know, what's the most important thing to you? You want to negotiate that first, but what are the other things that might be important to you as well? Those are the salary research resources in the Canvas site. We talked about getting the terms in writing. I want to point out that you need to negotiate based on your qualification and kind of market salaries, not on your needs. Because to say to somebody, well, you need to pay me 80,000 because I need that much for my family, they're thinking, what's in it for me as an employer, right? If you say you need to pay me 80,000, not need to, right? I would like to make 80,000 because when I look across the market, that is the salary that people are paying for UX researchers who have PhDs, right? That's a good argument, because basically what it's saying to them is, if you don't pay me that, you might be able to go somewhere else. Don't worry about having your offer revoked. Students sometimes really worry about that. If I ask for more money, are they going to revoke my offer? And the answer is 99% of the time, no, unless you're doing it in some crazy demanding, you know, way out of the norm way. But if you're merely saying, like, you know, the market is offering this, would you consider offering me, you know, 5% on what top of what you did? The offer is not going to be revoked, right? You are asking for something that is reasonable and oftentimes expected from an employer. Depending on the sector, things are negotiable or non-negotiable. If you are in a union position in a public job, probably nothing's negotiable. If you're working for a private, for a small organization, if you have a highly desirable skill set or rare, a lot of things are negotiable. So know your sector and what's going to be negotiable. I know I've mentioned that salary is not everything, and it isn't. 100% is not. But what we do know, because of, you know, the magic of compounding, you always hear the magic of compounding interest. The magic of compounding is salary is important because future salaries tend to be based on salary coming out of your terminal degree. Not always, right? I mean, I moved to this job and I took a pay cut because the other things were important to me, right? But often the first salary you make, right, other employers will say, like, oh, you kind of made this before, we're going to offer you this before, but we're going to offer you this much. So by and large, salaries tend to build off of the salary you're making out of your terminal degree as a general rule. So salary can be important to think about, especially way above bonuses. Bonuses get you something, but it's a one-time thing. And I think that's where I'm going to end, because I know I went far over time. Again, salary isn't everything. You know, people are 100% in this day and age, and always to take salary cuts for jobs they really want, for locations they want, for people that they want to work with. And so I think that's really important to remember. Okay. Questions. And I'm sure there are things in the chat. Carolyn, it looks like you may have even answered some things from Maria, but what should we be answering right now?
Yes, we have a couple things in the chat. Awesome. I'll start with Becca. I know Maria, you had put in a response in there as well. Becca asks about a opportunity to have an informal discussion of a possibility of a postdoc with a researcher, and should they prepare for this as a formal interview? And so it sounds like it might be a little bit more like an informational interview of inquiring about opportunities that are available with this researcher. So definitely prepare for it as a formal interview, as they might be asking about your research interest areas, as well as skills and experiences that you are bringing in. It might be a little bit shorter. They might not have any particular questions they're going to be asking, but we definitely recommend reviewing your CV or your resume and making sure that if they did ask about interest areas or like why you're interested in this particular researcher, you'll be able to answer those questions. And my personal recommendation is to follow up or end the conversation with, what's the formal process for applying for a postdoc, or, how can we move forward with this conversation if there's an alignment of interest. And so that's, I'd say, like a nice way to go about that. And yeah, definitely ask your advisor. Advisors are really great support systems if you have that relationship with them. And so they're a good resource as well too. Okay, Megan asks, does negotiation typically happen in a phone or in-person context, or can it happen over email? And if you want to negotiate or something less market-driven, like vacation time, how do you approach that? So do you have any insight, Mackenzie?
Sure. To the first question, over phone, email, context, over or in person, I think the answer is any of those can happen. Some employers prefer a certain format. I personally prefer a combination of email and in phone to lay out to the employer, like, thanks so much. This is, thanks for sending me the terms of my employment. It's great. I noticed the salary offering is X. When I do some market research, it's Y. Is there room for movement on the salary, perhaps up to 85? I also am wondering about the possibility of, some remote work. Could we get on the phone to discuss this? So I like that because it forces you to put it out there so you don't chicken out on the phone, which is what Mackenzie would do, right? Sometimes they're like, I'm gonna make this phone call, but chicken out. It has it in writing so we know what we're looking at. So I think that's a good tact. And sometimes it's okay just to do it 100% by email. That works as well too, especially if you're a person who's like, I do not like to have these conversations because I'm too uncomfortable. Now, knowing sometimes employers will be like, let's talk about that. I'm going to give you a call. So sometimes the employer will have a preference of how to do that too. But I would say as a person, I would recommend trying to use the format I'm most comfortable with, and then the employer may just switch to a different format. Negotiate on something less market driven. If you're like, that salary's good, I really could use some more vacation. I think you can say, these are great terms. One of the things that I'm wondering is if it would be possible to get an additional week of vacation. Right? Like, you can ask for it and they may say no, but they might say yes. So I mean, I guess the answer is you ask for it the same way you would ask for anything else. If you're saying like, how would I benchmark that across the market? Sometimes you can. Sometimes you can say, yeah, most people in an entry level position are getting 3 weeks and you're offering me 2. And sometimes you could just say like, so much of this is great, but really it's important to me to have another week of vacation. Can I have it? Employers think of this as like, by this point, the employer really wants you. Right? They're willing to flex a little bit because they don't want to have to go through this process again if they don't have to. So if you can come to terms that, feel good to both parties, and if I'm the employer's like a week here, whatever, and I'm in the position to offer that, then I might very well be willing to do that, especially if you're going to ask me for that versus $5,000 a year more, because that's going to come out of some budget line that I might not have.
I just wanted to add on to that about the question about emails or phone. Make sure that if you are on the phone that you have everything that you want written down, that you have something to hold on to, and exactly what Mackenzie was talking about, that you don't chicken out about things. If you have your own list, that is really helpful.
That was an awesome response. Thank you. We have another question about if a job listing states that positions can be remote for the right candidate, or similar wording. When can you bring that up in the interview or the negotiation process? My personal thought would be go through the interview process, and at the end, if it feels like you're really excited and this is a right fit for you, you can inquire about that at the end. Or if you want to wait for the offer first, because then that does give you, like Mackenzie said, a little bit more leverage. You can bring it up in the negotiation process. So if they listen in there, then it would be assumed that they have that flexibility to do that. And so waiting until the negotiation process wouldn't be an issue. But if you had other maybe opportunities you're waiting for and trying to figure out, then you can ask about that in the interview process. Sometimes there's also multiple steps, like Mackenzie mentioned, in an interview process. And so that can help you determine if you want to continue on in those interview processes as well. And so figuring out what the rest of the interview process looks like can be a helpful step to determine if you ask it then or later. But if you ask it in the negotiation process, then it does give you a little bit more leverage to make that request and inquire about what that would look like.
Yeah, and I think I would second that, kind of also based on the wording. Position could be remote for the right candidate. Well, if they pick you, then you're the right candidate would be my thinking on that. And so I think, there's certain other circumstances where I might ask earlier in the process, but I think on this one, they've indicated that they know it's possible. So I would wait till I had the offer on that one. And they might ask you earlier on. They might say, like, do you need to be remote? They might want to know. And then you don't have a choice. You have to answer then.
Great, thank you. We have a couple minutes left. Do folks have additional questions? I don't know if you mentioned this, Mackenzie, but I always tell people negotiation is a good practice. Even if you feel good about what they offered you, you can always ask for more. And if they say no, you still feel good about what they offered you. And it gives you good practice to build up self-advocacy skills as well too, and get comfortable talking about finances and job, because ultimately people have jobs, and a big part of having a job is that financial source of income. And so you're also fighting against the status quo when you do it as well too.
I would second that. It is highly uncomfortable. I still hate doing it. And I'm almost 55 years old and had so many jobs in my life, and I hate it every single time. And I make myself do it every single time. And sometimes I get things and sometimes I don't. I've had jobs where like, nope, sorry. But it gets easier as you practice it. And, short of a job where you just have step increases like a union job, you will be using this throughout your life in terms of working on aspects of your job, sometimes salary, sometimes adding a job duty, dropping a job duty. With this thing of negotiating with your employer is a lifelong skill. Okay. Any last questions? Great. Well, thank you. I see some names and faces that I've seen at most of the workshops. We really appreciate you attending. I see some new names. That's also phenomenal. Please fill out those feedback forms to let us know how we can improve this for next year. You're always welcome also to drop us individual emails to let us know about certain things, but we hope to always be able to have this series moving forward in the future. We want to make sure it's suiting the needs of students across the university. So thank you.
All right, thanks everyone.
All right, thanks everyone.